I'm Kristof Van Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
Welcome, Jeff Eaton. I don't know where we're going to end up with, but
I think when we've had a chance to talk about this stuff, we've touched on everything from refactoring Drupal's form widgets to how data should work. We've gone all over the place, so I'm definitely excited to see where we end up.
And also today I have as my co-host, I've got Christoph Weber, who's a colleague also. But we were talking okay, I really want to be part of this story. So thank you, Christoph, for joining today. Yeah, we're looking forward to wherever this conversation is going to lead us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Jeff, I don't know how much you've seen about what this podcast is about, but just a short introduction. It's this is the API Resilience Podcast. I don't know if you've seen where we have gone over the years, but
I haven't. I know I've caught individual bits that have come up as you've mentioned episodes over the years and stuff like that. But when you dropped me a line, I realized, I'm very curious. What's the overarching theme? What lives under the API resilience umbrella for you?
So it's I've talked about it as an API philosophy podcast. It's what is the philosophy of doing APIs? And it's it all started during the pandemic because there was this idea of this is going to mess up everything, and actually APIs can provide resilience to organizations, and that was the core idea. And then we had I had several co-hosts. I had Mark Winberry that I started it off with, and then we were looking at how are APIs helping organizations be more resilient, and then what does this mean for our customers that are building developer portals, with how they should help their business to get through all the shocks that were happening in the economy. And then I had a little while, I think that I was doing it alone, but then I had Mark Bergauer. That was a complexity story arch, where we're talking about complex adaptive systems, the heart of complexity science. Well, we had some really interesting guests, and I want to talk about some of these things with you also, enabling constraints.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with this stuff, but it's very, very fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've known me for quite a few years for my time in the Drupal community, and I would say that I've always been a magpie. I spot shiny things like systems theory, and hey, data, or and over the years. I'll spot those things and I'll dive in, and I would hesitate to ever call myself an expert on any of those things. But I feel the last, 20 years or so for me has been a process of digging into all of these different corners and trying to pull together the important threads where these different practices inform each other, and where how the editorial experience of a CMS can be informed by operation and workflow modeling, or how the lessons that the data community ironed out in, say, decades ago in the process of, digging into the complexity of structured documentation content can also help solve problems for highly variable marketing content, years and years later, for folks who would never even think of, touching data or something like that. Mm-hmm. How have the insights and, the different perspectives figured out interesting things that can be useful to other practices that might not necessarily pick up on them? So that feels like a thread that's been running through my whole career.
So because like maybe we can start here a little bit. Like, what are you up to recently? Because I've seen like you shifted from being Mr. Content structured contents in a Drupal company to Mr. Structured Content.
I'll step back and, Kristof, I apologize if this is, if this is like the indulgent backstory or anything or something like that. My career started early on as like I was a freelance journalist. I did, news and copywriting. Then I ended up going into a marketing company, and this was in the days when like desktop publishing was the job that you got hired for, and stuff like that. But at the same time, the web was just starting to pick up as an actual medium that companies might want to work with. And I was already tinkering with it in the background because that's what I do with stuff. And it seemed a lot more useful than Gopher at the time. And so I ended up becoming like the first web developer at that marketing company, and then ended up being the person who sort of maintained the server that sat on the desk next to mine. And over the next couple of years, ended up diving really deep into not just the creative side of web, of web design as it was back in the day when you got out Notepad and you started making HTML files. I started getting into how to use code to actually generate those files, and then using scripts to like pull stuff from a database. At the time that was like, that felt pretty cool. And then I ended up becoming a webmaster for a small nonprofit and working with that, and then ended up diving into just actually working as a software developer over the next however many years. But I ended up coming back to content management in probably around 2003 or 2004 because of some personal projects that I was sort of trying to build out. And over, here and there, I'd been sort of tinkering with my own little web content management system for projects that I worked on. And I wanted to tackle this new big project. And in retrospect, I had sort of roughed out what amounted to Drupal's node system. It's like, oh, well, you've got this basic concept of a content thing, but then there are subtypes of it, like an article or an interview or a calendar event or something like that. And you want them to share certain properties, but then have differences. So how would I structure that? And I ended up ironing out a fairly decent like data storage format for that stuff, and then realized I've got to write a CMS now. I don't want to do that. And that's how I got involved in the Drupal project when it was pretty early in its maturation cycle, but it was just starting to accumulate things like CCK, the content creation kit. And probably about a year after I got involved in the Drupal community, Earl Miles ended up rolling out the first version of the views module. And, you know me, I tend to think that the content creation kit and views and their ability to work together for people to build out custom structured content and then different query-based views of that structured content, those two tools together, I personally think, are responsible for Drupal's rise as a successful large-scale CMS. Similar things might have happened in other ways. There were lots of discussions going on about that kind of stuff, but those two tools being there early on and putting the ability to model that stuff out in the hands of, it still required technical knowledge, but it didn't require you to like build a whole CMS from scratch in order to have that level of customization in what you had. And that's really what got me started down the, structured content path, because as Drupal matured and the gaps in, what plugins were available and what things it could do got filled, more and more of the challenge of any large Drupal project became figuring out how you were going to model things. As the tools got better, the modeling, the actual implementation of the model was not as tricky as figuring out what model you ought to be implementing, because there wasn't a technical answer to that. There were all kinds of ways you could tackle it, and what you were really trying to figure out is about organizational needs and future expansion requirements and how to compromise between flexibility and the ease of editing, and that ended up defining like the next however many years of my career when I worked at Lullabot, one of the big Drupal agencies. Most of my time at Lullabot after that point was really spent doing Drupal architecture and content architecture and figuring out how should a big Drupal content publishing system work for this particular client. What do they need? How do they need it assembled? And over time, I got deeper and deeper into that and dealing with even, like multi-CMS web ecosystems that our clients were working on and how they needed Drupal to talk to other stuff. I think it's probably in those final years that I was at Lullabot where a lot of my time was really tackling like complex institutional challenges of like, how does a big company figure out what its content should be and how that should interact with a design system and how the editorial tooling should, cross paths with the underlying data storage structures and stuff like that. And the design system aspect of that was particularly critical for a number of projects where I saw big companies that had built out essentially their own large-scale enterprise page building tools, and everything looked good on paper, but then when all the pieces needed to come together, it was like, I don't know if you've ever watched the Three Stooges sketches from back in the day, but when like the three of them would all try to walk through the same doorway at the same time and they'd collide and, haha, big laughs. That was what rolling out a lot of these large-scale CMS systems that had to integrate all those pieces felt like. It was like, these individual pieces had been built well, but then weaving them together revealed how these different disciplines were coming out from different directions, and putting that together was tough. So I ended up forming Autogram with two partners, Ethan Marcotte, the co-inventor of, essentially the person who coined the term responsive design back in the day, and Karen McGrain, who's also fairly well known in the Drupal community. Her work on content strategy and mobile and decoupled and multi-channel transitions that organizations are going through. And together we were really focused on a lot of that kind of stuff. Since then, Ethan has actually moved to the U.S. government. I got to tell you, it's, we worked on some fascinating projects, but when he got the chance to say, hey, what if I were to, work on getting the U.S. government's websites better and working with that team, that made a ton of sense. So Autogram is basically Karen McGrain and I specializing in tackling these large-scale institutional content challenges. Sometimes that's content modeling issues. With some clients, it's been almost entirely working through the organizational process questions they have. Sometimes it's large scale. With a financial services client, we helped them as they were planning their merger with another financial services company, and their educational libraries. Both companies had these big educational libraries of content, fully fleshed out, full schemas, full strategies, and they needed to merge them together on a short timeline. And so tackling the question with them of, okay, how do we do this? That touched on almost every aspect of their digital publishing infrastructure and their distribution. With some other clients, it's been like, hey, we're actually replatforming, and our CMS is going is hitting end of life. And we realized we need to take this, little sub-site we have for our marketing content and figure out how to effectively roll that into, our main site, classic information architecture and organizational questions and stuff like that. So yeah, we worked on a lot of different kinds of projects, but like the common theme is almost always, large or small, working with companies to figure out how to untangle some sort of confusing or conflicting aspect of their content, or how to handle complex migration from one platform to another, or how to take a look at a web ecosystem that isn't really working for them and they're not quite sure how. I'm quite sure why. That aspect of it is something that we've been digging into more and more over the last 2 years or so, especially. Working on building systems of what we're talking about is like content observability, where you're not just, running reports on what the engagement rate for every page is or something like that, but you're actually building a feedback loop where you have regular ongoing ways of measuring how different types of content are contributing in different ways to the bigger picture of what your whole site's trying to accomplish. And working with organizations and figuring out like what those different roles that different types of content are supposed to play, what the measurable outcomes for each of those different kinds of things is, and how to put those metrics together to form a bigger picture that can be a real actual daily feedback loop rather than just the quarterly spreadsheet or something like that. That's something that we've been focusing on, like in particular over the last year, and that's been really exciting. So anyways, sorry, that's the big circuitous path through my whole career, that hopefully, maybe you can cut some of that, but that's how I got where I am now.
So, and I have I've got a follow-up question ready, but first I want to ask Kristof, like, how have you have met, I'm sure, like with Jeff. Have you met before, or?
Indirectly.
Yeah, I know we've crossed paths on the internet and like LinkedIn articles and stuff like that before, but I don't think we've ever had a chance to talk.
Exactly. Yes. I've known your voice since forever because you've been a regular on the Lullabot podcast, which was one of my introductions into the Drupal world when I decided I need to dig deeper here. And so, yeah, it's exciting to be together in a virtual person and then exchange things. One thing that struck me is you said, I'm not really an expert in any of the things. And I think that's true of all three of us. And I think that's actually a distinguishing features for that makes us uniquely qualified to do certain things, like having an overall view, as opposed to being stuck in our expert corner of the world. And it provides a huge amount of value, I think, because we've done so many things. We've dabbled with a whole bunch of things. We know a whole bunch of technology plenty well enough that we can have an educated opinion about it, but we're not stuck in it per se. And I was reminded when you said early on when you looked at these systems. I was into FrameMaker before it became an Adobe thing, and it was HTML derived. And I compared it to other text editors that were out there at the time. It's like, well, this is the right way to build a system because it is structured under the hood. This is awesome. I can define what I want my output to be. That was my introduction. And then I sort of moved sideways for a long time.
I'm always fascinated by that because like SGML, back in my, freelance writing days, a couple of articles that I ended up writing for a technology client were all about, I think, the city paper in Philadelphia migrating all of its archives to SGML to go on the web in 95 or 96 or something like that. And it was fascinating, because I feel like it was a lucky opportunity there to talk in depth with people who were digging into that stuff. And tools like FrameMaker that you were using, it's like those were really formative, I think that was like, that's pre-XML.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, HTML is the mother of all of those languages, and then others followed, including HTML and XML, which were derivatives, but all derived from the same idea that that we can structure content, because as the S in HTML is structured, and that's the thing that struck me. And for a while, I was involved with people that derived ontologies, and that's where it went off the deep end, where it's like, at some point, just my eyes glazed over, and I thought, oh, good for you, but man, I have no idea what you're talking about right now.
If you want some fun trivia, it turns out SGML actually was derived from GML, which was developed by IBM in like the 70s, just generalized markup language before the S even got added to it. And like some of these techniques that we're working with, I mean, they go back to like the earliest days of like companies really starting to get, computerized, let alone on the web and stuff like that.
I have a lot of topics that I want to talk about. One is about feeding the AI monster, and as like the new content or the new role for content. Well, let's dig into that in a moment, because we're on the XML track, and I want to dig a bit deeper here, because so we've in Pronovix we've had this arc. We started in the Drupal space. Like this, where I learned all of this stuff. But then about 9-10 years ago, we started specializing in developer documentation and API documentation. And one thing I learned from the API space is that there is the prehistory, which was like about XML APIs, like the good old SOAP era, and that's like demonized, because like it's this, oh my God, like these crazy people, and REST is so much better, and so on and so on. But it feels like there's this, well, there is that touching point between the documentation space and the API space there, about like how are you structuring content. And I think that's maybe an interesting thing to call out, just how much shared heritage these two spaces have with each other.
We mentioned XML and HTML came from SGML, which came from GML, which actually, just double checked, goes back to script, which was just script, which was made in, I think, 67 or 68 at IBM, because they needed to make documentation. And they needed, they all, what they had was ASCII, and they needed to make documentation in some sort of consistent and reliable way. And what I find really interesting is that what we think about as APIs today didn't even really exist at that time. Like the idea of this standardized interface by which you can make one program that talks to another program and does its stuff, that felt like a significant shift. I mean, that ties in with like, the Unix way of making things, where it was, you'd make different programs that could just pipe each other's input and output to each other and stuff like that. And you could compose more complex things out of those simpler pieces and stuff like that. And like today, you fast forward, however many decades, and everything is built that way.
Yes.
Sometimes to our detriment, considering how many like sedimentary layers we've got. But that idea of picking up all these different pieces that we've got and assembling them together and reusing them to build more complex stuff is so fundamental and inherent to how we think about making stuff, that like even when we talk about, oh yeah, I'm going back to the bedrock and building my own thing from scratch, 9 times out of 10 we're still doing that on top of 6 or 7 layers of this stuff, because it's all been accumulated, and so much work and energy has been invested in that, and there's so much value in that. That relationship between documentation and API is interesting to me, because I still kind of think of them as two separate things, but they they come together particularly. What's interesting is when you talk about documenting APIs in particular, that's when this idea of the way you describe the interactions of computer systems in a way that's like a compiler could go in and read through it and then build out code based on your description, and how a piece of documentation software could parse through and look at the same stuff and build out documentation. Like that idea that in the world of APIs, the idea of actually single sourcing or making somewhat self-documenting things that sort of branch off into, well, there's this software artifact and there's this human readable documentation artifact, but they derive from this same central thing. Like that in particular is really interesting, because I think like that space is a little more complicated than either one of the separate ones.
And here's one of my talking points I had for today. So I start to see, or I think I'm seeing, I'm not sure, it might be a mirage, but I start to suspect that we're about to have a phase change of the internet from the internet of publishing, where we publish documentation that people have to go and consume to transform how they are to be able to act differently in the world, to the internet of interaction, where you can just say, I'd like to book a ticket to your LLM on your phone, and then it is able to consume the API and then act certain things out, still checks with you, like, is this really what you want to do? Is that something that you're also seeing? Like, is this, and it's, I have a whole story about the open interface web and a bunch of other stuff, and we can dive in there later. But is that something you also see happening, or what do you see there?
So I'll be
frank.
I'll be open and frank and say that, like, although I really enjoy working with them and tinkering with them and building stuff around them, I'm deeply skeptical about LLMs and like generative AI for a bunch of different reasons. Not just I think that's that's a bubble. That's silly. It's not so much that as this concept of like where meaning comes from is a really important one when we start talking about these kinds of deeply complex artifacts, like a thing that can be transformed into documentation and a working software artifact simultaneously.
So I'm with you on the,
okay,
let's take a pinch of salt with this whole LM stuff. But what I'm not talking about bots that do whatever, or that are telling you the answer. I am in the camp of, you need really, really good content. Without that, all of this is worthless and it's just going to generate crap. But I've seen some examples of people that are like asking about, hey, can you do an API call against this thing? And it actually does it. And that's just like kind of crazy. I was talking with somebody who had spent a lot of time in China, and he was saying that WeChat, basically that the internet there is shrinking, and that WeChat has like taken over a whole bunch of functionalities that people normally would go and do on websites. So there is an interaction platform that they have developed that has really gained dominance, where if you want to sell something, if you have a support line, any kind of digital interaction, you'll build some sort of plugin for WeChats where people can go and do those things. And like that is that shift from, I just like search for a support line and then I go and pick up the phone and call them. There's that shift from, I go and look for how to do something and then I have to go somewhere else to do it, to I look for it and I can immediately do it. That transition is happening there. Yeah.
So I would definitely agree that like there's a significant shift in like the expected interaction models. I think one of the big shifts is that we went from computers being standalone machines that had sort of a pile of data on them that you could do a thing with, to computers being intermittently connected to each other. You could dial up, pull down new information, or do something interactive in that moment that you were connected. And then as that was starting to take off, and you had, like the old days of like dial-up services like America Online and CompuServe were sort of bringing that model to fruition, the web just exploded. And what I find interesting about that web explosion period is that from an interaction perspective, it was a very simple model. It was you request a document and you get a document back, and then you can look at the document. But what that document could be was meant to be very flexible. Well, that gave birth to a whole world of stuff. And over time, like more and more interaction models started being built on top of that, like even using databases to pull back dynamic content, and then starting to do transactional type stuff where you were logging into something and getting dynamically built information just for you, or sending stuff and making purchases, e-commerce, all that kinds of stuff. And then as that started turning into different services on the web working together to build composed experiences, like you have, web APIs and software as a service platforms. And now there's a whole world of developers who've come of age where a website is something you assemble out of other websites, essentially. Yeah. It's you're building on top of SaaS layers, and even it may not be as the most efficient model to approach certain challenges, but even building serverless and saying, I'm just going to kind of put glue code out there that stitches together a bunch of other stuff via these underlying API models by which they exchange stuff. At every step of the way, in isolation, everybody who's building their own experience can sort of build layers of new complexity and richness on top of the sort of massive, the roiling mass of services and platforms and endpoints and data and stuff like that. Inside of their own sort of space, they can build a new little tower of custom interaction. And I think that's been Apple's philosophy for a long time. The idea of we operate, philosophically a closed garden that we can control and build well. I think that every one of these big shifts where that closed model gets broken down and now things are being created out of these combined and componentized things, and you can build a new layer of stuff on top of what's there. I think that brings a bunch of new capabilities and a bunch of new complexity that people have to grapple with. And I think one of the challenges of the current era is that a lot of people are sort of facing that like complexity overload with all the different pieces that go into making a working website that, it's like 10 years ago, you might build using WordPress or Drupal or just straight PHP or, whatever your framework of choice was, and you'd build it and run it on a VPS and there it would go. But building it using the sort of modern approach of integrating all these things, there's tons of moving pieces to figure out and pull together. And I think the promise of LLMs as a discovery and explanatory tool for somebody doing this exploration stuff is that it does so much of the legwork for you when you're trying to hunt down that stuff. How do I do this API? How does this service's API call work? Is there a good way to stitch service A to service B? How do I get these things all talking together? And I think that promise of having like the intelligent assistant to help you wire that stuff together is intriguing.
But that is the build thing. So I'm separate. Well, I might be looking too far into the future, but all the the personal agents that just makes your booking.
Right.
So I think, and like right now, I think what has happened in China with WeChat is that the web of interacting has separated from the web of publishing. And that's the web of interacting now predominantly happens in WeChat, because that's where everybody has that's the platform everybody has standardized on. And because of that, the web of publishing, the internet, making websites has become much less important. And actually, websites are like the budgets. I don't know about the budget, but the story that I heard was the website, the open web kind of thing has become less important, and this platform is rising. Now, I know there's this promise that LLMs will do developer work for you. I don't really buy that, because I think that the whole thing about development is that you have deterministic systems that are predictable and that you can like bet your business on, that it's not going to ruin everything. So I think the stakes are too high. But if you're talking about like doing a single transaction as an individual, I think this might be different, especially if you are supervising what is actually going on and you're part of that conversation that is helping you to do a certain transaction, like filing a support request or something like that. And I have both Jeff looking like, I have a lot to say about this, and Chris putting up his hands.
Yeah, go. Go for it, Chris.
I see a middle ground here where, what you just described, Jeff, where you get the tool help to compose. And, we've been talking about autonomous bots for a long time. It sort of comes and goes. We've seen them, and it's never been ready. I think now we're at a very different point where interfaces are formalized enough that bots can actually do bot work in the way bots are supposed to work, number one. And number two, they've got enough inherent knowledge absorbed that they can do the work in a meaningful way for a human. So it's what I see happening is that maybe these composable systems become composed in the moment. You have a requirement, the bot goes out, puts it all together, all the data, and presents you with the options, and use the human and say, all right, let me go for that flight ticket instead of the other one.
Yeah.
And you get enough input that you do think, well, this has been exhaustive. I'm happy with the outcome. I'll make a decision. And as opposed to building a flight consolidation site, that is the old way. The new way is I can consolidate for you based on all the interfaces available to me and my knowledge of you and the world at large. And I can bring this together just in a moment. I think that's currently a possibility that is very real, because we do have the necessary ingredients in a mature enough state.
So I think this is actually, I feel like what we've been doing is sort of describing our way to the crux of the question here.
Yes.
I think that like interaction story is compelling. And I think that in any place where people have actually managed to build that around a particular cluster of tasks, it's tended to be a pretty good experience for folks. It's tended to be. I emphasize tended. I think the biggest concern that I have is that historically, building those things has required complex modeling and mapping of what is involved in doing that thing. Some of that's data ingestion from specialized sources. Some of it is, what does this task flow look like? What things will I need to do in order to accomplish it? Stuff like that. So historically, at least, that has required complex modeling and development of like what this assistant is going to do. I think that the big question for me, and that's what I think is the big debate we are currently having as an entire collection of industries is, does the LLM generative AI model give us a significant boost in that zone towards being able to realize this? Or are we still ultimately going to be doing the work of building those things out just with some new data ingestion tools and some new communication with user in natural language tools added to our toolbox? I tend to believe from everything that I've seen that the answer is the latter, that like we're getting, LLMs bring some useful tools to our toolbox for data ingestion and natural language comms with the user on the sort of edge of that workflow and the task. But under the hood, the meat of it that makes it that task is still something that has to be modeled out by humans and built, because the nature of LLM architecture doesn't make it great for that. Where it is able to sort of simulate that process, it always tends to be just echoing latent structure in explanations of the process humans have written in the past and described, in the underlying source data. It means that it can echo the process. It can describe the process as other people have described the process, but doing the process with the actual underlying decision points and stuff like that doesn't appear to actually be going on under the surface. And that's where a lot of the work in RAG and knowledge graph assisted, LLM stuff, I've described it to a lot of clients as the stone soup story. It's yes, you're gonna make an amazing stew, but it's the village that came together and got all these ingredients and made the structured data and modeled the, individual tasks and defined what the, checks and, guardrails were around each step. And all those ingredients that got added to the stew made the stew, even if there was an LLM being used at various points along the way of taking the user request and turning it into
ingredients.
They're asking for stew or something like that.
Well, I've described it LLMs as grease, they're semantic grease that helps you to map from your idea of how the world works and how you describe it to how other people think about it. And it kind of like a GPS resolution function where you give an address and it figures out what coordinates you actually want to go to. I think it's something like that function that I'm imagining. You still have to build all the interfaces that are actually going to fulfill the task flow in a way that your organization is happy with. I'll
say one of the most frustrating things that I've dealt with in the LLM space is, for some of the work that we do, one of the different tools that we've built in Autogram, because we tend to work with large clients who have a bunch of websites, maybe running, we like to talk about it as the 17 websites in a trench coat problem, where an organization's digital footprint is actually this huge pile of different systems that are all stitched together and kind of working together. And when it comes time for, say, 6 of those to migrate to something else, a lot of orgs are faced with questions like, where are the edges even? What do we even have here? So we ended up building a spider crawler tool that's optimized for those, hey, we've got 17 websites and we need to map the edges of them and figure out the structures of them. And, where did we jam a bunch of React stuff and which ones are running on Sitecore and which ones still have those old Cold Fusion scripts running? Which ones cross-link to each other? Which ones have the same design system versus different ones? Those kinds of questions are ones that we're doing. And initially, our thought was oh wow, we could wire LLMs into this and do some really wild stuff. But one of the difficulties that we found was that reproducibility that you mentioned, the ability to like crack open the hood and like go down a couple layers in, the system and say like, okay, well, what I need to do is, not just feed in a textual request, but I actually want to like, pop down a layer to like the embedding model and like start, tracking like how it's, pulling these associative things together, because we actually want to work directly with some of those associative connections. And what we found was that, and, again, this could be one of those, the experts know how to do that. You've only scratched the surface kinds of things. I don't want to assume too much, but like, at least so far, I'm fairly confident in saying that there's no great way to break like the chat wall or the chat bot barrier with an LLM and go partially into how it's doing things. Once you do, and this is what we've actually done with a couple of different models like there, you're actually not using a chatbot anymore. You're just saying, we're using an embedding, we're using an embedding model and using like what Elasticsearch has been, what we always did with like complex fuzzy search for years. We're doing the same thing. It's like, oh, now it's now we're just using machine learning again with, with a big embedding model. And I think that's tremendously valuable. This is not to discount that. Like, there's a ton of work that has now gone into making ridiculously powerful embedding models that can be leveraged that way. And I think that's one of those a new tool in our toolbox kinds of things. However, I think the real difficulty for me has been LLMs as an ecosystem still really either live at you're building chatbot instructions, potentially very complex ones, or you're back to using an embedding model and like you're doing machine learning stuff.
But you're talking about LLMs for developers. I'm not talking about that. Friday, I go to London with my son, and I asked, like, okay, suggest me a program. And it comes out with a really nice program, like go visit the British Museum, blah, blah, blah. Well, you could imagine with a very, very small step, like if we're not trying to build scalable software that is going to be always right. We're just trying to make something that consumers can use to make their life just a little bit easier. You could imagine saying, okay, give me a program and order me all the tickets for the museums. And that is possible today. It's very, very close. Like as an enterprise, you cannot afford that because you want a constrained, predictable thing. But as a consumer, it's like, I don't have the budget to pay for a developer to create me the perfect app that is going to help me solve this problem once. Of course not. I don't want to I don't want to download another mobile app that is doing this thing like only for London. I don't want that. I want something general purpose that's just good enough to make my life a little bit easier. Sometimes it can fail. That's fine. I'll catch it when it fails. I just wanted to just like reduce the complexity a little bit for me.
I think that actually is the really critical question, though. Like, I think that's the crux of it. It's absolutely easy to imagine that barrier being crossed, but I don't think we're seeing it yet. What we're seeing is in certain really well-trained task areas, they can do well. But the question remains whether there is enough training, whether there's enough extant training data in the world to start filling that in with more generalized tasks.
Oh, but actually, but you can have a bot that connects you to the bots. So it just needs to be that first gap that tells you, okay, so here's a program, and like, okay, British Museum, you want a ticket. Let's go find out, do they have an API? Yes, they have an API. They have like a whole process for ordering a ticket. I have your email address. I can like send you to this payments. We will need some sort of payments thing that enables you to do payments through the thing. But you could imagine, so the LLM so that agent that you have does not have to be really smart. It can actually be pretty stupid. Probably it should be stupid enough so it fits on your own device, so that you can use it without sharing all your data with other people or with corporations. But then, like, it just needs to be able to connect you to other systems that are still built the old way, like highly constrained, predictable, like, not going to mess up payments, not going to, like, oops, spill your data somewhere, all of that stuff. So it's like the personal agent as a tool for to go out and explore interfaces that are available, and then to come back with a programmatic interaction that is just good enough, even if it's very limited.
Okay, so I think we're starting to zero in on what the real fundamental challenge is. A lot of the enthusiasm around, like, discoverable API endpoints and stuff like that is because it makes those things, like, traversable and parsable, not even using LLMs, just like you can like write an API discovery tool that if anybody has the correct endpoints out there, you can figure out what the mechanisms are to interact with it in an automated fashion. And, that's pretty spectacular in my opinion. But the problem is there's still this huge world of stuff that doesn't exist in that automatically, in that structured, self-documented, discoverable and parsable, interrogatable in an automated fashion way. That, like, the ability to have code that looks at the code and figures out what the code does, that, like, self-interrogation aspect of it is incredibly powerful where it is supported and available, but there's, like, the long tail societally of tasks that need to be done each day that do not have that kind of thing that maps to them. And the promise of LLMs, at least in theory, is that it can maybe fill in those gaps.
Forget about LLMs. Actually, let's talk about let's talk about the open the interface web.
Okay, well, I do want to say real quick, the reason I think that it's important to think about the distinction between this meta system of interrogatable things that explain themselves and can be discovered, and then the LLM model of sort of hoovering up a big corpus of stuff and tracking the associative connections to a point where you can dialogue with it in plain text. I think that what LLMs have convinced a lot of people of is that it will be able to fill in those gaps where the system hasn't yet actually arrived, that it could fill in those gaps. But that's where the actual accuracy and reliability and dependability of it drops off a cliff. And it's essentially just like an example is I write a lot of SQL code, SQL queries, and I also use a multimodal graph database called ArangoDB in a lot of my projects. And it has a query language called AQL. Nowhere near as many random examples of source code for AQL queries. And I have yet to find an LLM that's capable of answering my questions about ArangoDB queries without a third of the way through drifting into SQL. Because that's what it has to work with. And the syntaxes are close, but and that's an example of where it becomes useless for the task because the fade off is subtle but significant. Now, that doesn't mean that this network of self-documenting interrogatable systems isn't incredibly powerful. I just am deeply skeptical about what some people think LLMs will be able to do gap filling of.
So fully there with you. I think like one of the first things I heard when like we did an event about AI and APIs and documentation, and one of the stories I heard people talk about before we actually did the event was, yeah, actually we're rebuilding our developer portal, and you'll just be able to go there and ask a question, and it was just going to give you code, and you no longer you'll need to be looking at API documentation. It's like, so, and I have heard now about one company that started as a customer of ours that used Drupal to build a bunch of good documentation. And they say now that they can generate, and that like 95% of the times they actually get a good result. And they're like, this is good enough for us because the segment that we're targeting, this is fine. And like I'm a bit flux on the exact numbers, but like significant portion of requests that people ask from the bots comes back with a good answer. So we're good. But that's RAG because they have like a bunch of documentation already that they can use to generate those answers. Well, I wanted to check in with you because like if you are seeing this, it's the proportion of documentation and interacting. They're like two faces of the same coin. And like we started with that, like XML started as a documentation language, but it actually became a way of explaining how to interact and to document, or actually to do interactions and to do programmatic interactions. So there, it feels to me, or I suspect that when you have enough APIs, maybe even if you forget about LLMs, if you just have enough APIs, you might be able to move from a web where everybody needs to do a whole bunch of research to be able to understand what are the possibilities, to a web where stuff just happens and you can just you can just order something and next day it's on your doorstep. Okay, Chris.
I've heard you, Jeff, mention things multiple times, and that was structure. You talked about latent structure that's out there, and some of it is more evident and some of it is extremely explicit. I think my sense is we need to be, as a community, as the entire world, more deliberate and intentional about outputting structure in our documentation, in our knowledge, in our writing, to allow the automation to pick this up and use it. Because if Christoph, if we just talked about, if we have enough APIs, that just means adding more structure to me. In the e-commerce example for the London trip, it's about all the metadata that's available around the e-commerce to make this it's all structured to me. So Jeff, I'm curious, do you agree, or what's your vision as if we want to move into the next step of the web where there's more autonomy and bots maybe, or assistance, we need structure in the content?
So I would say yes, that we do need that. If we desire a future in which automated agents can act on our behalf, that fundamentally relies on more of the world's information and more of the world's actions and tasks and the atomic things that can be done being exposed in these parsable and interrogatable ways. Like that's, I would definitely agree. I think there's two pieces to that, to actually answering that. One is that sort of already there? Are we getting there? It's just, like, William Gibson's, comment about the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. Coincidentally, it is most evenly distributed in areas where commercial entities have built businesses on automating systems and thus had a significant financial stake in going in and ironing out the structural aspects of how to define a particular space's information, like, travel information, stuff like that. Google and the rest of the, structured data communities work on schema.org is, I think, a good example of that. Like on one layer, you've got like JSON LD as one of the common formats in which schema.org data is distributed. That's one layer. That's like your encoding format so that a computer can decode the data. But then schema.org is that ontological meaning layer of here's a particular agreement on what we mean when we say X, so that you can find this data and not simply parse the bits of it, but also act on those bits because of the ontological meaning that is combined with the serialization format. And I think that like both of those pieces have to be aligned. Like, XML can be used to encode meaningful semantic data that follows standards that someone can look at and understand. But you can also encode information in XML in a way that no one other than the original creator has any clue how to operate it on it. And it's basically, it's like the secret, Wittgenstein's, private languages thing. It's like it exists in the head of the author, like Microsoft Word save data, and it's in XML, but good luck if you're not like the deserialization engine for Word that reads that back in and turns it into a meaningful Word document. So like the balance between the agreements on like what is the endpoint, what is the encoding format, how is the data structured so a computer can walk through the tree and reconstruct the tree is one part of it. And then there's that semantic and ontological agreement of, well, when we say open date in the context of a store, that means when the store is technically begins operating as a particular business. In the case of a film, that means when it, it's like all of these semantic definitions of what those very fine bits of meaning are all about. Both pieces have to be ironed out meaningfully. And I think like that, schema.org, an example that I love coming back to, you can tell what spaces have been nailed down because the baseline stuff is things that a search engine needs to be able to tease out of web pages and present in like the search results. That's the best and most agreed upon stuff. Then there's this sort of diffuse layer of additional stuff. And that continues to grow as more and more work is done to, to pull more into that layer. But I don't think that there's any way to escape the need for that agreement on meaning around those things that need to be discoverable and interrogatable and parsable. Because one thing that we haven't been able to get to, and I think LLMs, they're fascinating for me because they're sort of the big meta attempt to do this, and I don't feel like they've actually managed it. It's an attempt to say, well, what if we didn't do the semantic part? What if we just let an engine figure that out somehow?
Yeah.
And it's like, and it turns out even when it's able to, even when it is really able to, what it's actually doing is it has found lots of people talking about that.
Yes.
And is then echoing what they said. And it's like that's that latent structure present in 6 billion Stack Overflow discussions or hundreds of thousands of Reddit threads in which people said, hey, what's the best places to visit in London if I'm there for a weekend? Like, there's an amazing degree of getting close that LLMs have managed via like the semantic meaning that humans negotiate around human language every day. And it's tantalizing how close it gets to some of those things. But what fascinates me is every time you hit one of those areas where everyone hasn't ironed out an ironclad agreement on how to talk about things, it falls off, and it becomes obvious that that engine isn't actually capable of doing the figuring out. It's just slipstreaming on that.
Fully agree. And like, this is also what I'm telling people, like, don't expect magic from this thing. It's like with a GPS. So even if you have a really, really great algorithm of figuring out what coordinates a certain address coordinates with, without all the maps and all the work, like going down the road, figuring out how fast you can go here, if you can turn left or right, and all of that stuff, it's completely worthless because you can't get there. So I think what LLMs are doing is they're giving us this mapping software that if you have like a good database of this looks a little bit like a street name that exists in this place, so maybe you're meaning that you want to go there. I think that's what it's doing. Like, it's not doing any magic of figuring out where to drive or how to drive. It doesn't do any of that. It's just a mapping algorithm that helps you to span the distance. It's taking your personal local context and embedding you into the global context that is evolving and growing. But the regardless of if LLMs can do this or not, I think the trends that I think is happening. And then I'll drop it. but I think there's this trend of going from documenting to actually doing. That is really interesting. Because you used to have a website that says, well, this is the website of our shop, and like our opening hours are this and that, and this is the stuff we sell. And now you have a website where you can actually buy that stuff. And you can, and maybe they don't even have a shop anymore. So it's that transitioning from like documentation that tells you how to do things to the thing that actually does the thing. And that is happening. And the LLM is just that tiny little bit that maybe helps with some part of it. What actually needs to happen is all these maps that need to be created.
It's the agreed upon plugin points existing where the manner in which you can announce, I sell widgets, or I give tours of London, or I am available on Tuesdays from 5 to 9 to do X and Y and Z. The agreements on those kinds of connection points have to exist for that system to work. And I think from a technical standpoint, it's really thrilling to see how much of that is beginning to come together and beginning to evolve. I think I feel like the jury is still out for me on whether, like a civilization level, it is a net positive or not to push farther and farther in that direction, just because every agreed upon language implies the exclusion of certain things. Just because what makes a language useful is that it does certain things, not everything. There's no universal human language that can perfectly turn human thought into transmittable stuff. Every language is just an attempt we've sort of hammered together to effectively talk to each other and communicate. And you see the same things with software tools that get built that have capabilities. The most useful ones are the ones that have developed an opinionated take on a problem that can be solved and what to do it with. And I think as we start talking about like connecting more and more of the world using these kinds of interfaces, at a human level, one of the big questions we have to grapple with then is, what do we exclude when we say we want to wire everything together? Are we saying we want to wire all kinds of commercial interactions together? Do we want to say we want to wire together all transactions? Do we, I mean, and that in and of itself would be a solid, goal or whatever. But like, I think one of the things that I find interesting about the web and, the concept of information sharing in general is that there's a lot of non-commercial, non-transactional stuff that underlies that. It's sort of like the soup in which that stuff swims. And I'm not sure what it looks like to start trying to map those things to that kind of a model. I think.
Do we need to?
I don't think so, but I think that's also the thing that we need to be collectively very open and very transparent that we're not attempting to do. Like, what we're trying to do is make sure that you never have to use 9 apps to book a trip anymore. You can do it in one place.
I think the parallel is like, this is a story I've told a lot about, like, to explain people, like how to go from a product to utility. I don't know if you've encountered Worley mapping.
Yes.
So great. Like Amazon, if you're buying stuff on Amazon, basically is a utility for e-commerce. It's super elementary. Like their product pages are not structured. There's very little structure there.
Semi-structured. That ugly, weird middle zone.
It's horrible.
where product weight might well contain the name of the author instead of the weight. But 90% of the time, it'll be
kind of works. Yeah. But the reason why Amazon works is because there's lots and lots of people that have made it their business to create affiliate websites that explain which of these 5 products you actually should be buying, and the comparison sites. So a lot of that knowledge is not contained in the place where you do the interacting. It's outside of it. And it's a combination of these two worlds that then helps you to actually do the transaction that you're looking for.
And this is where we come to the, you talked about how there's going to be 97 different topics that ultimately tie into this. Because once you start talking about building a system like that, now you're talking about complexity, and now you're talking about emergent systems that will grow out of it. What you're talking about isn't designing a service that does everything, but rather a service that incentivizes and provides the sort of kernel of it, but then offloads other aspects of it via incentives. And I think one of the challenges is, and Amazon is a great example, where one of the biggest problems now is that knowing whether or not there is any way to trust a website that recommends a product is a crapshoot at this point, because unless it's high profile and in a product category where there's a business to be made, doing high profile, heavy investment, product reviews, like, Wirecutter or, Consumer Reports or something like that. Outside of those spaces, the actual monetary incentives that are out there have actually bred an impossibly huge ecosystem of essentially automatically generated chaff websites that scrape Amazon product reviews, average them out, feed them into a natural language processor, and spit out a sort of slurry of product information-ish text. And then that in turn has incentivized manufacturers to build automated tools that spam product reviews with stuff that will feed back into those things to boost things. And I feel like a lot of, anytime we attempt to build a system by which the system will maintain the system, then we get into those complex systems theory questions of what are the incentives, what are the feedback loops? Have we built something that, like a lot of the internet, will work great until it grows, and then it will actually become terrible and also have crowded out the good stuff that existed but was inefficient previously? It's like, email in the days before spam was very straightforward and very simple. And then it turned into an arms race that inevitably, is sort of an ongoing rolling nightmare in most people's inbox and has been for decades at this point. And we got used to it. There's benefits to it, but at the same time, the assumptions and limitations of what were baked in early on mean that, well, we kind of got what we got now. And I feel like the more ambitious our attempt to build a system for X, the bigger X is, the more I think there's a fundamental responsibility for us to grapple with what is it, beyond the imagined scenario where we could make it work, that we could get there question. I do think that's possible. I think what we don't yet have the reach for is figuring out how to not just turn it into the next internet, the next email spam, or the next, the next Amazon Marketplace scenario where, unless it's, a major brand you've already bought from and the product actually exists, you essentially don't know whether a product is even a real product or not, or if it's just, drop ship, or whatever. Do we have the ability to figure out how to not make the next version of that problem in a space?
Do we even have the choice? Isn't like you talked about the weapons race? This is already happening. Like, somebody will come out with this thing. And so I think my fear is that we're going to end up with WeChat, or like a Western version of WeChat, where you have a single platform where you have the enshittification happening. You start with, oh, this is really cool. And then oh, now these people are being squeezed out. So now everybody's being squeezed out. And it's and we have a crap platform and it's time to move again.
Yep.
But so this is why I think that there's an opportunity for an open interface web where organizations can define their task flows, their interfaces, the ways that you can interact with them, in what cases you can use them, and what is okay usage of those interfaces. Don't call our CEO with a support requests. We have a support phone line, that kind of stuff. Because if you think about it, a big function of websites today is the declaration of all their interfaces that they have. We have a phone number, we have an address, we have a support team, we have a sales team, we have a procurement team. Define we have this mobile app and this is how you buy it, or here's how you get a subscription, here's how you cancel it. But right now, this is all in unstructured. It's like structured marketing text, but it's not structured as an interface and declared as an interface.
There are ways to expose it, like with schema.org. You can say, this is our phone number. This is our phone number for this department. This is our URL for our mobile application for the Mac, the iOS platform. But those are spots where the ontological meaning of the bits has been ironed out. And when you journey outside of those specific areas where the meaning stuff has been ironed out and agreed upon, or at least asserted by someone central enough that everyone gets on board, again, you're back to unstructured, marketing text, or, just, humans writing stuff and reading stuff. And, there's this, so probably about maybe a decade or so ago, when, was working at Lullabot, and one of the things that we were facing was like, the company was scaling up, and the question of how you keep in touch with everybody. Like, the leadership team was like, how are people doing? Like, it's something you can do with a dozen or 24 people, or, maybe 30, 40 people. You can have that daily sort of the rituals of like, oh, you look in, see how some of the conversations go. And I think, Bob's having a rough day. I'll check in on him or whatever. But like, how do you scale that? And that was a question that we were grappling with. And we went through a couple of different things to figure that out. And one of the things that I did was whipped up a very simple IRC bot that let people just sort of do mood check-ins with like, thumbs up, thumbs down. And then because we're nerds, it turned into a 1 to 5 scale, and the idea was you could just have those ongoing mood check-ins for stuff like that. And you could see how folks were doing. And then we started thinking about like, okay, well, what if we could also do like natural language, parsing of stuff. We could do, sentiment analysis of, the same stuff that was flowing through there. So it wouldn't be a question of whether or not somebody checked in, but, sort of how is their mood doing? And then a corollary to that was, well, what if we map it to projects? Like, hey, this person does really well when they're on a large team project, but when they're asked to go solo on something, like their mood plummets after a couple of weeks. And we got to that point where building it was like within our grasp. We had enough reach to start building this and do some interesting things with it. Just enough reach to make it possible to do very interesting things. And then what I realized was I have just designed an emotional panopticon for my own company. And at the same time, there was a whole thing starting to brew about retail companies essentially hiring and firing workers based on whether or not they could maintain smiling, engaged presence for, an 8-hour shift, day in and day out. And if they weren't rated as being highly engaged and, effective, they were failing at their jobs and they needed to bail. And I realized, I have not made a system by which we can intervene and help folks who are failing. That is an aspiration. That is a motivational aspiration. What I've made is a system of fine-grained monitoring of people's public behavior. And what I dreamed of doing that required this system to do it at scale was very different from what I was actually building, which was kind of a horror. Like I made something that I legitimately feel was horrible, and we just stopped it. We just, not because it was like, this is a moral abomination and we have to stop this from ever happening anywhere. And one of the other team members actually said, look, well, like, if we can flesh this out and put it together in our spare time, other companies are going to end up building this too. Like, why not us? Like, why not do it? 'Cause we've got good motivations and like, we want to do something really cool with it. And I don't have an answer to stopping panopticons from being built. All I can do is stop building one when I realize I'm building one, even if what I want to do with it is something I would argue is good. And I know this takes us way far afield from like the what's possible, but I feel like that's the kind of question that, like, this sort of explosion of capability that our industry has achieved has put more of us in this position of now saying, well, our grasp is significant. Our reach is, we could make that thing. And I think all of us are now being faced with questions about, like, what would it mean to make this?
Anything that requires the whole world to agree to not to act is not going to work. It's just, so I think it's more, but is there a poison pill that can protect the world? Is there a certain thing that we can build that with some other constraints can keep us on the right path or the better path?
I think one of the challenges is that often that is directly in conflict with the goals of
Making
like
money.
productivity and stuff like that. It's like, and this comes back to the question, to the fundamental question, I would say, of resilience.
Yeah.
Resilience is not compatible with 100% efficiency. The nature of being resilient means there is capacity to deal with the unexpected. There's capacity to take a hit and bounce back and sort of roll with change in ways that weren't explicitly anticipated. That's like the, the systems thinking definition of resiliency almost. I don't want to say it is, because doubtless there's, the last thing I want to do is, get somebody get somebody saying actually, because that's but like and to a certain extent, building resiliency means accepting that there are going to be ways to dial efficiency up at the cost of that resiliency that will not be apparent until the need for the resiliency arrives. And I don't know if I'm not aware of a way to like magically square that circle.
I don't think it needs to be squared at all. I think we're talking about the long tail that necessarily exists and will be the source of the resiliency. And I've sort of got a nascent LinkedIn post in my mind ready to go to celebrate the regular people among us, the non-superstars who provide that resiliency because their actions, one at a time, like yours, to not build that panopticon, generate a strong undercurrent of normalcy that underlies everything.
I think also, like, we kind of had this resilient web of content. Like, the internet is an amazingly resilient web of content where, like, having the architecture of a client that can interact with all these websites out there, that's basically what we need, the new version of that. And I think there is this shift that's already here, where we are going from where can I buy this thing to actually I buy it, or how can I turn on my washing machine, or like to actually I just click this button. That is already happening. And the web of APIs is doing that transition. So like, how can we build something like a browser for that web of interacting, so that it doesn't have to be like WeChat, where you have a central place where you go to interact, but like we all can have our own version of it, and we can have our own plugins, and we can like mod it and keep it private. I think that's what we need in the West. As like the distributed, resilient answer to the centralized web of interacting that I think is happening.
I think it's definitely promising, and like we're at a developmental stage where that functionally means people becoming developers, but with simpler tools or streamlined tools on top of a more complex pile of tools. Because to a certain extent, defining those kinds of connections and those kinds of capabilities and announcing them to the world in a way that's interrogatable is the work of that is the work, even if we build better and better expressive languages in which to describe the thing, like the work of it is still there. And I think I definitely think we're getting to the point where there's like enough stability beginning to occur in those sort of like discovery and announcement and interrogatability layers that like people will be able to describe their thing so others can use it without having to learn to build an OAuth 2 endpoint, for example. Like that kind of stuff, I think is definitely getting there. But like, again, it's all about what are the, how are we shaving off more layer, what are we shaving off in terms of complexity to make that possible? How are we dealing with the stuff that is outside of our capacity to describe with that new streamlined mechanism? What does the failure state of our descriptive language look like? Does it mean you simply can't do those things and we have no way to talk about them? Or does it mean, oh no, you still got to use an app for that? Or, oh, there's still a website for that? Does it mean those things, the ability to do those things that cannot be described using the new meta language, just get crowded out entirely? I don't know. I mean, and I think this is like a question that every time a new sedimentary layer of functionality forms, those are questions that get grappled with. I do think that I really do think it's sobering though for like our sort of generation of builders, where like, I think, when we got started, like just as the internet was sort of beginning to become a thing, like it was the pipes that you could imagine this kind of system using, but it wasn't that system yet. It was literally just the pipes for it. And that meant that the things we built and like created, they sort of had a built-in, there was enough friction that like the radius of the explosion, if I blew up my computer, was basically, my personal reach with the thing that I'd made. And we're building more and more layers to make everybody's reach broader and broader. And then we also have, organizations that recognize the potential value of it and are pouring, nation states worth of resources into doing it at scale so that they could realize the benefits if they do manage to accomplish, this new meta layer of doing stuff. And I think it's fascinating, but like I think it's also very sobering because like removing those inherent layers of friction that were there in inefficient systems that we worked with, those early systems, I think is an act of also removing some of that resiliency. It's, we're building the efficiency, but we're also making it more efficient and more capable by squeezing that resiliency of the whole system out, because it's inefficient to have all of us have to go out and figure out how to wire these things together. What does it mean when that inefficiency isn't there anymore and everything just gets wired together automatically? I feel like it's very easy to sound like a doomer, grappling with these stuff and say like, oh, this is how we get gray goo and the robots eat the world. And I don't think we need that, as a scenario to grapple with. All we need is like, hey, I made a chat bot that lets us check in and see how we're feeling. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I've made a horrible panopticon. It's like, it's like that ability to accidentally make the thing that enshittifies stuff is there. And it also makes it easier for anyone who doesn't care that they're going to enshittify things if there's enough money in the process. Like that efficiency and the automatability, like we've hit this point where I think grappling with grappling with that question is just as important as grappling with the next step of enablement, because we already see what can be done and what can occur even with the current layer of stuff. And yeah, I think that like, I don't know if there's money in solving that problem, but I feel like there's huge amounts of societal value.
Jeff, you presuppose participation, right? We have the enablement. I think that's within reach, but then there's the question, do people actually participate? And there's some interesting data points I've seen. For example, a few days ago, I watched a video by Rick Beato. He's one of the big music guys on YouTube. producer, and he talked about AI-generated music, which is fairly credible these days. And he said, I had one of these songs on and walked through the house, and then my son said, Dad, why do you listen to this AI-generated crap? And he himself cannot differentiate an AI-generated song as a music producer, right? Very highly educated, and the real stuff. But his kids can, both his kids actually, it turns out. They've already developed a sensibility of calling BS on certain output, and they choose to not participate, which I think is really sobering in a very good way. It's like, hey, look, we have emergent behavior where they say no to the gray goo.
Yeah.
This is cool. Non-participation is a thing, I think.
And I think that definitely encourages me, but like it definitely raises questions for us if like the societally valuable option is mass opt-out. Like, there are ways around the system, but if there is enough benefit to like that becomes its own arms race for people, for whoever is incentivized to find and extract the value that is there in the opted out areas. It's sort of like, the web scraping community, it's like you may have data that you are not exposing in an automated fashion, but somebody out there with a copy of Playwright and a pile of Python code is determined if there's value in what you have to extract that, whether or not. And, again, it's that arms race question of like, is there a way to stop it? I don't know, but
we have the example, like we need a Mozilla Firefox for interactions. The commercial project failed. I think there's a very good chance something like that will happen with AI. Like the really centralized commercial project fails, and the distributed, all the gazillion Llama instances that people are running, maybe they get light enough that you can run them on your phone, and now there's an open source thing that you just run on your phone that is actually better than the commercial thing because it's actually built for you and it knows you, and you can trust it because it's on your device, and it's not like some centralized thing where Big Brother is trying to sell you diapers because it looks like you're pregnant. I think there are options. This web of interacting is coming. It's already here. It's just we don't know really how fast it's going to come, but yeah.
This I think comes back to our to the comment you made earlier. It's like is opting out of participation in this particular phase of building a new layer of capabilities just a matter of opting out of the economy to a certain extent? It's like, is it basically like saying, well, I'm only going to barter, because you have problems with a credit-based system of commerce that everything is fundamentally, running on. Well, maybe, but I think as technologists and as people who build stuff, and also people who engage with the questions of how and why stuff gets built and to what end, those are critical questions. Greg Dunlap, from who I worked with at Lullabot for years, had his father was a physicist, and he often tells this story about how he talked to his dad about just a lot of these questions about that the technology industry is sort of wrestling with, and his father said, yeah, sounds a lot like the kind of conversations we had in our field. And he says, oh well, what happened? He says, oh well, we built the atom bomb.
Yeah,
and then like that changed the tenor of a lot of conversations about could versus should in the world of physics, where simple reach for new technical frontiers everyone doing that research had to grapple with what might be on the other side of this new technical reach that I am making. And I don't think that necessarily has to be a way of like demonizing physics. And, it's not like, it doesn't mean being a doomer about the technology industry, but I do feel like collectively we're sort of at that point. I think we may actually be at that point in like the 1950s where everyone was really excited about atoms and didn't realize they were giving themselves cancer, like licking paintbrushes, with radium to like paint the watch dials and stuff like that, because it's just, it's this new thing we've got.
Yeah.
And it will, I don't know which side of the line we are on right now. Are we in the Manhattan Project side of the line, or are we on the, minimum wage, workers painting watch dials with radium and giving themselves cancer side of the line? I don't know which side we're on yet, but I do think that both as consumers of technology, as creators of technology, and as people who assist other large companies in building things and, pushing those frontiers, I do think it's critical for us to wrestle with that, because I, again, don't know which side of that line we are collectively on right now, but I really feel like we're pushing up to it with the kinds of systems that we can now create.
Yeah.
And, that's not doomy. It's just like hey, we've won. All of us who were noodling around on basement computers decades ago and thinking, oh man, wouldn't it be cool if we could just do this kind of stuff? It's like, we're doing it. We're doing it, and part of, I think, growing up as a culture and as an industry means sort of saying, oh, okay, well, we did it. Now we're doing a different thing now. We're doing something new now, and we've got to grapple with that. I think that I feel like that's where we're at. There's such a world of possibility in front of us, and it requires care to build things that will bring more benefit than harm.
And I think this is why the main story of LLMs today is completely wrong. Because the main narrative is, oh, this is just going to automatically do all of these processes, and it just will figure out tasks, and we don't need developers anymore because it's just going to happen on its own. I think that is completely wrong. We went very long. We always go long, but this time we went exceptionally long.
Well, I both apologize and want to say it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a blast.
Thank you very much, Jeff. This was really awesome. It's really good to reconnect.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kristof, for joining in, for going along on the ride. I need to think about what you said about the where's the line, and what is this brave new world that's in front of us, and how do you build the next Firefox instead of the next Facebook? I think that's probably the question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Kristof and Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.